What's going on, listeners? David Ramsden Wood here. Hope you are having a great day. Couple things before we start this week's episode. Number one, we are coming up on 100 episodes in 2020, and I want to thank all the listeners who've tuned in. I hope it's been fun. I hope it's been educational. I hope it's opened your mind on some topics, and I hope I haven't annoyed you too much at times. I know I can get a little bit excited, but it's been a really fun year, and I really want to thank you. So if you have enjoyed the show, I'd ask you to go to wherever you download your podcast, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or somewhere else. Write us a 5-star review and let people know what you like about the show. That's the best way for our show to grow and for us to get the very important voice of oil and gas. I am not the voice of oil and gas. I am a contributing voice. And it's really important that we get to talk about real issues with the larger place, because with continued ESG pressures, there's continued climate change, we're not talking about trade-offs, and the media is not talking about it. We need to, so I implore you, I ask you, please, write a review so we can get this out. This week's episode is a really important episode. We have Adam Anderson of Innovex. You may have caught the story in some of the press that got picked up. As a Christmas gift to his approximately 450 employees, they were going to get North Face jackets. And when the distributor went to North Face and said, hey, we have this huge order coming in, they checked brand consistency and felt that North Face didn't want to co-brand alongside oil and gas companies because of their various stands. So Adam and I talk about that on this week's episode. We talk about climate change, we talk about corporate initiatives, we talk about trade-offs. But the most important thing is we're forgetting that everything we do in our life will require fossil fuels. And maybe there's a transition at some point away, but we're not there yet. And we're not talking about the batteries that are required. We're not talking about the wind and solar. It's not always sunny. It's not always blowing. And you need steel and concrete and heat and transportation to get those things there. And without heavy machinery and fossil fuels, our world doesn't exist. And I think Toyota's CEO came out on Friday last week, which would be December 18th, and said that in order for Japan to move to a fully electric grid, it would cost somewhere around the neighborhood of $350 billion to build that infrastructure just so people could drive. So it's an extremely important conversation. We cover a wide range of stuff, and I really appreciate the listeners. We're going to have some best of episodes coming out. We're going to re-up the newsletter. We've changed services, so you'll see that. We're going to focus on the oil and gas stuff, and we're working on some pretty cool partnerships with some other groups in media to give you the straight, honest goods without the narrative that mainstream media is trying to push. So without further ado, thanks for joining, and here we go. What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden Wood for another episode of my Hot Take of the Day podcast. And this week we are joined by Adam Anderson, who I have actually known for, I was trying to think about that. We had coffee in Cherry Creek like maybe 2 years ago. Yeah. It was part of my, and those who know me know I basically meet a new person for coffee at least once a week, if not once a day. Just because I really like people. And then the pandemic came. It turned out that both coffees were outlawed, and I don't actually like people that much. So I only really have people left over from like back when civilization was a thing. But I'm very lucky to be joined by Adam. So first of all, thanks for joining. How are you doing? How's the pandemic?
No, we're doing well, though, all things considered. We've enjoyed life during the pandemic for the most part.
Now,
obviously,
go ahead.
I would say, obviously, the industry aside, things have finally bottomed and started to recover. But I think all things considered, things are going well.
Yeah, if you only look at the last 6 weeks, and with the people on Twitter doing the bull runs because they're all up like 150% in their energy portfolio. And of course, they saw that a Biden win combined with losing seats in the House for the Democrats and having a Senate runoff that no one's even concerned with, combined with the president saying a vaccine was on the way and then it arrived when he said it would arrive, except after the election, that everyone is on a bull run, and it's nothing but good right now, Adam. I'm not sure if you were aware of that, but it is currently an epic super bull cycle in all commodities because pandemics are good, actually. If you shut down,
we'll take the upcycle when we can, I guess.
Exactly. You can shut down the economy once a year, and we're going to hit all-time highs every year. It's going to be perfect. But okay, seriously, let's talk. There's a couple topics we're going to talk about today, but I want to talk about Innovex first because I think you've always had an interesting business model, and obviously in 2020, as oil and gas as a business has evolved, it must be different. So why don't you talk just briefly about Innovex and what you and I got to know each other about?
Sure. Yeah, so Innovex is a business that designs, manufactures, sells, and services a pretty broad array of well-centric products. We think about the business in three broad product segments: well construction, which is our float equipment, centralizers, inflates; well completion, which is frac plugs, liner hangers, toe sleeves; and then well production, which is the newest part of our business, which is predominantly ESP accessories, ESP feed-throughs for packers, wellheads, along with some of the associated wellhead equipment. We operate mostly in the U.S. with a little bit of international exposure, which is mostly the Middle East. We do our own design work, manufacturing, sales, and then we have a pretty broad distribution network across the U.S. and, again, facilities internationally in Saudi Arabia and Oman.
And how many total employees do you have doing that?
We're about roughly 400 employees today.
Okay. And were you able to avoid layoffs in the downturn?
Unfortunately not. We were at about 650 last year, let's say through the early part of this year. And then in the March-April pandemic, the worst of the worst, we had to do a lot. We asked a lot of our employees through that period and ended up having to reduce our workforce fairly dramatically, unfortunately.
Now, for people who aren't familiar necessarily with the oil and gas industry and are tuning in on this, what is it about well construction, like the products that you offer? How do they work just in high level terms, and why are they important in the process and in the safety and operation of the oil and gas industry?
Sure. So if you look at the well construction products specifically, most of those are products that are specifically utilized when you run casing and cement casing to ensure cement gets pumped properly, that it's set in the right spots, and it's set there for the required period of time to set up and get good zonal isolation so that the hydrocarbons go where you want and not where you don't want them to go.
And so if I could just jump in on that. So you run casing, you back it up with cement. There's multiple strings of casing, there's multiple strings of cement. And when that process works, which is a regulatory requirement and is virtually all the time, you have zonal isolation not only from groundwater at surface, but then all the way down through into your zone of interest, which in zones in areas like the Permian and the Bakken would produce around 10,000 feet below the surface. So almost 2 miles of casing and cement. Okay. So fairly integral. And as a thank you to your employees this year for quite a brutal 2020, you and the company decided that you would purchase Christmas gifts. What were those gifts?
Yeah, so every year we do something a little bit different for Christmas, or at least the last few years, and it's been coffee cups or something like this with the Innovex logo on it. This year, as you said, it's been a particularly brutal year for all of us, particularly those in the energy business. So we decided that we would get jackets for our employees with the Innovex logo. And so we had some very nice jackets. A small batch ran earlier this year of North Face jackets that looked very nice. So we decided to reach out to the North Face and see if, through a distributor, and see if we could get 400 jackets with the Innovex logo on it for our employees as Christmas presents.
Okay. And so it was through a distributor. You had the conversation with the distributor of North Face, and they said they had to go back to the North Face, given the size of that volume, to get North Face's approval for putting the Innovex logo on a North Face jacket with the North Face logo. And their response, unfortunately, was that they would not co-brand. We did not meet their branding standards, which is, in more detail, they said it was because we're an oil and gas company and they didn't want to co-brand with oil and gas. The same way there's some other undesirable industries they would not want to co-brand with. Are you aware of, after this conversation, what those other industries that they bin oil and gas in? Is there like porn or
tobacco.
or
Alcohol, tobacco are three industries they explicitly call out that they do not co-brand with. Oil and gas, they don't explicitly put it on their website that they don't co-brand with, but they clearly have the same views around branding as they do with some of those other industries.
Okay. So and I mean, I've had debates about this because, as you know, I got kicked off LinkedIn. I got kicked off of LinkedIn for false information, which was to say, when I said the phrase virtually zero chance of dying of COVID if you're under 50 and healthy, and have been saying that since March, which I think the stats have actually shown to be correct. Because, I mean, there isn't really a definition of virtually. Virtually is very small. And I currently have 5 families who are associated with our family and all have kids. And not only is at least one member of those families, in some cases, all members of that family are COVID positive, and one person has the sniffles. And I know it's going to come as a huge shock, but they're all going to survive. But so if we shift back to the branding, they have a choice, right? North Face can say, hey, we don't like what you do. You know, we don't like tobacco. We don't like porn. We don't like oil and gas. They seem very similar. And so we're not going to sell to you. I mean, is that your complaint? Is that they wouldn't sell, or how do you think about it?
No, I think, hey, I agree. They've got a decision to make as a company on who they want to brand with and not brand with, and I don't, fundamentally disagree with their right to choose who they want to partner with. I wanted them to consider the irony of that statement for a couple of different reasons. To me, and I come to this extremely biased, like you. I'm a longtime oil guy, and
well, of course, and I think that's when I have been asked about this show. You and I have been friends for 2 years. We've stayed in touch. We compare notes. We're also in an industry that we're both very passionate about, that has been, I would say, inappropriately beat down, and it's through intellectual dishonesty. And so, like, the stand that you're taking in our conversation today is going to be based on intellectual dishonesty. That I think. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah. Go ahead.
No, but I think that's absolutely right. So our view was not that I don't have a fundamental disagreement with their right to choose to market their brand however they choose. But I think I wanted to hear directly from them why they view oil and gas in the same light as they do some of those other industries. So I think that's the core thing I was trying to get at. The more and more I look around at our country and the world more broadly, I think there's this increasing view that what the oil and gas industry does is negative, and I guess I just fail to understand why folks don't understand the totality of the goodness that oil and gas does. Yes, it comes with some trade-offs, as does every other thing in our lives. And I was just trying to make folks understand, and VF Corporation and North Face understand specifically, that there are many wonderful, great things about the oil and gas business that we should celebrate.
Now, I will say, as a bit of irony, and again, I mean, the reality is, and I've said this before, I've said oil and gas does not have an ESG problem. It has a G problem in the governance, and it has a problem in terms of the valuation of these assets, much like Tesla, much like Airbnb, much like DoorDash. The valuations to me are stretched based on the fact that we're an underlying net asset value business. So I'm not begrudging corporations for making choices and for investors in investing, but as I understand it, VF is the parent organization to North Face. They own other brands in their wide plethora of consumer choices, of which one of their brands, if I read correctly on Twitter, I don't know if I can pronounce it correctly, but one of their brands makes fire retardant safety equipment, which is marketed directly to oil and gas companies to protect the employees making the oil and gas, which then gets used to make polyesters, which go into fabrics, which make jackets, which are sold by the North Face, which they will not sell back to the same people that they sell the fire retardant to. Did I do that in a correct, honest, transparent way?
I think that all is an accurate representation of it. Yes, Bulwark is their brand that is largely has FRs that they predominantly market to industrial businesses such as oil and gas, and that's a pretty common brand you see across oil and gas.
So let's talk about the reasons that you think that oil and gas, and again, I know that this is a polarizing subject, and I hope that there are those that are listening that are not in the oil and gas industry and are coming to this debate, which it is a debate and a discussion on the freedom of brands to choose who they sell to, which we both totally support, and the freedom for brands to take a stand on things, but also to recognize, like, I think one of North Face's, like, they want you to explore the world. I can't remember their vision. Would you remember their vision offhand?
You know, I should know it because I was just looking at it this morning. It's explore more or don't stop exploring or something you can.
But do it in like an environmentally sustainable way, right?
Right.
But like people wear North Face to go climbing in climates that are not hospitable to humans who are a light-skinned, non-fur bearing creature who live in places in the world that are cold. And then we drive our SUVs or Subarus, mostly got gas powered, out to the mountains where we wear our polyester fabrics to go climbing in nature. And then we come back to our gas-fired homes because it's very, very cold in the winter. Do you find that it just blaming oil and gas companies for making a product that people use and consume, do you find that the onus should not be on the producer, it should be on the consumer? Or how do you think about where the fault of all this climate change discussion lies?
Well, yeah, I think my view on my point's slightly different, I think, is that I think I agree with much of what you said there in the sense that I think people frequently take this view that the environment is inherently hospitable for humans. And if we change it in any way whatsoever, that is therefore bad. And I think if you look throughout the majority of human history up until 200 years ago, you would see that the environment is not particularly hospitable to humans. And in fact, it's only been through our ability to conquer things such as energy or to utilize very dense sources of energy like oil and gas, so we're actually able to create an environment for ourselves where we can thrive or flourish. So I think my view is that more than anything, not only the oil and gas industry, but also the industries that take advantage of oil and gas should be prized for or cherished for what we do to help humanity survive and flourish in today's day and age.
Yeah, I mean, and I think so. We're going to talk about this conversation in two ways. I wanted you to highlight, if you would, the points from your letter around, I think, energy poverty, energy density, and again, I don't like the way our society has gone because we can't have a discussion without people tuning out. And they have their echo chamber of, well, I think fossil fuels are bad, so therefore everyone who talks about the goodness of them is bad, and I refuse to listen to any of their points. But for those three of you who are still listening, I would love to hear the points you made in the letter about energy poverty, and then we're going to talk about some of the discussions in the media around how realistic the climate emergency and climate apocalypse is, and then we're going to compare it to COVID in terms of a health disaster and health apocalypse.
I might stay away from the second one, but I think on the environmental issues. So I think that one of the main topics that is, I think, poorly understood, certainly by those of us in the West who benefit from low-cost, reliable energy, is how many folks live without that. And one of the points that I made, and again, most of the points, by the way, that I make in that letter are somehow a riff off of Alex Epstein's book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuel. So few of those ideas in that note are original. Most of them are simply a condensed view of other folks that I follow and respect and think have good views, interesting views on this. But I think with respect to energy poverty specifically, nearly 1 billion people in this planet live without electricity. Without any kind of electricity at all. And those folks need to burn solid fuels, wood, dung, other sorts of solid fuels that have all sorts of negative impacts on the local environment as well as the humans specifically who have to live in houses where they burn solid fuels and what that does to them. I think we take all of that for granted. We're able to fire up our natural gas-fired stove in our kitchen and cook 4 things at once, and it has zero impact on the environments in which we live and operate. And I think we take that for granted. So I think that issue of environment or scarcity of low-cost, reliable energy really does impact people's lives negatively in a way that is really poorly understood and hardly discussed at all in the context of energy.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I'm trying to remember the specific number because it is a big number, and we'll put some links to the show notes. But it's either 600,000 or 4.3 million people die a year. I know that's a very big thing.
Either way, it's a big number.
But I think the 600,000 might just be China through air pollution. But the point being, and we've had Mark Mills on the podcast who's talked about it. We've had Alex Epstein on the podcast, and they've talked about it. So we've had lots of people weighing in on this. But the number of deaths a year of people who use solid source fuel to cook and to heat, and they don't have light. So as soon as like 5 p.m. hits, there's no ability to read books. There's no ability to be connected to the internet to figure out what's going on. Like basically, darkness ends the day in terms of all forms of activity for like 1 billion people on the planet. And from using dung and wood and other sources to heat and to cook food, the number of people that die in the world from that far, 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 far exceeds the number of COVID deaths we've had, as an example. And so we don't think about that in our cozy America with 326 million people who have 2 cars and heat and low-cost energy, and they can go swimming outside when it's 30 degrees at a hotel and the water's 88, or the governor can shut down restaurants in Denver and it's 32, but you can eat outside under a propane heater, and that all of that is made possible by the miracle of fossil fuels.
No, absolutely. I think we take that for granted.
So how would you, to critics who said, well, why would you pick North Face as an example? And I think you covered that in that you like their product. They're a great product. And because of the size of the order, they said, hey, we're not going to co-brand. What would you have done differently, or if North Face was listening right now, what would you say, or what would you ask them to look at or research in terms of their position vis-a-vis oil and gas and other industries that perhaps they view as less than savory?
Yeah, so I think first off, if I had to do something different, I actually didn't realize North Face was this way. I was aware of a few other outdoor brands that I put in that had this view of the oil and gas business. I didn't realize North Face was, which is why we ordered from them. Going forward, we'd probably do that differently. But I think the main thing I was really trying to accomplish is engage in an actual conversation with folks who have this view, and talk about the merits of our industry and the trade-offs associated with our industry. And the idea that the world would be better off with fewer hydrocarbons, less use of low-cost, reliable energy is, I think, just incorrect, or at the very least incomplete. And so I think folks only focus on one particular issue without focusing on the totality of the issue at hand. And I think that the main point I was trying to make in the letter is low-cost, reliable energy is super important for reasons we just elaborated on. Today, hydrocarbons are really the only way to do that at scale. It's not to say that there aren't some solutions where solar, wind, hydro, other things make sense. In fact, nuclear might make the most sense. If you ask folks who know that industry particularly well, it might be the one that could accomplish what folks want to accomplish, but that's not really my area of expertise. So what I would say is, based on what we know today and the technology at hand, hydrocarbons are the only way to deliver that low cost and reliable energy. And then lastly, I understand the view around the risks of CO2, or I say I understand it. I'm cognizant of those. I haven't studied it in great detail the way many have. But what I would say is that any impact on human life that you can look at over the last 150 years has been made better through the use of hydrocarbons, low cost, reliable energy. And so even though there may be some change to our natural elements, whatever the number is, roughly a degree Celsius warming of the earth over the last 150 years, we are so much more robust as a human race in order to respond to any change that might inflict because of our ability to harness low cost energy. So to me, that's like the single fundamental argument that's misunderstood by the climate catastrophists, is that I can't predict what's going to happen in the future with Weatherford, and I think with weather. And candidly, I don't think the scientists can either. But what I can say is that the last 150 years tells us if we have more low-cost, reliable energy, we will absolutely be able to adapt to our environment in a way that humans continue to prosper and flourish. And I think that's the single most important argument people ignore when they talk about these topics.
Well, and I think about in terms of life expectancy. And I mean, even going back to like 1935, which is a poignant time in human history, especially during COVID and where the economy is and the Great Depression of 1929 and between wars. But life expectancy in 1935 was 61. The reason I know this is because Social Security was put in 1935, and you had to be 65 to get it. And now we've increased the average expectancy of humans in under 100 years in the United States, where we have access to cheap energy, from 61 to north of 80. And that is solely because we have access to, plastics for medicine. I think I saw highlights of the COVID vaccine was put on planes and trucks, both of which are fueled by fossil fuels, in refrigeration, because in Pfizer's case, it has to be kept at -70, which without high power creation and refrigeration units, which are fueled by fossil fuels, and they are stored in plastic like boxes with plastic peanuts around them so that they don't crack, so that we can send this out to the world and people can get a vaccine. Weren't plastics bad? Wait, is it just me, or did plastics take like a total, like, oh, you know what? It's very bad for the environment, and plastic straws are done. So at every golf course, we're going to go to paper straws, which means unless you drink your vodka cran in the first 37 seconds, you're going to be sucking on paper. But then all of a sudden COVID hits, and I learned this, is most restaurants don't have commercial grade cleaning because they can't clean enough dishes. So like at the airport and golf clubs. So the reason that they went to all plastic this year was because they couldn't clean at a high enough temperature, which also then begs the question, what about every other thing that was on their plates for the rest of time that weren't being washed off? But this time, so that's why we went to plastic, and it's everywhere, which also is made from fossil fuels. It's fascinating. It is fascinating. So anyway, on that point, trade-offs. The trade-offs to me feel like it's you can live longer and you during your life will explore the world and have a carbon footprint, or the trade-off is we can reduce fossil fuel consumption, shorten life expectancy, have less kids, have less wealth, have less mobility, and then the world will be, I guess, in a better place. Is that your view of the trade-offs?
Well, I think that's the argument. I think that is the trade-off, yes. I'm sure that's not how many people characterize it. I think there's this view that there is an alternative readily available today to just displace hydrocarbon, I think is what people with that view would say. It's just not obvious or evident that those alternatives are available at scale in a way that they can displace low-cost, reliable energy for the Western world, much less for the developing world. So one of the points I was trying to make in the letter is if you look at the case of Germany, it's kind of quite a famous case where as they've tried to migrate towards renewable energy, the cost of electricity is, I don't know if it's doubled or tripled exactly, but it's gone up dramatically over the last 20 years. And is now, again, something like 2x what it is in the US, all directly as a result from a desire to go to renewable energy and the need to build basically an entirely redundant hydrocarbon-based power plant on the back of that in order to supply energy at times when you can't do it with the renewables.
Well, and Mark Mills, who I've had on the podcast before, a super bright guy, Manhattan Institute. He did a video, and this is probably going to be a trigger word for some people, but the PragerU, have you seen these videos that they distribute? They have some really good content, and Mark did about a 5-minute video that we'll put a link to in the show notes as well. But he talks very specifically about the trade-offs. So for instance, wind and solar, and I've talked about this on the blog before, but to make a solar panel requires something called an electric arc furnace. To make the steel in windmills, you need coal, not only to generate the source material, but to heat it and create the steel, and a tremendous amount of cement, and that cement makes a huge carbon footprint as well. And so, a point is, without fossil fuels to mine all the earth metals that are required for both wind and solar, without fossil fuels, none of that would be possible. And then the batteries that they need to be able to store the energy, because and everyone says this and you get people roll their eyes, it's not always windy and it's not sunny for half the day. And so you can generate a tremendous amount of electricity during the day, and there is a maximum efficiency in technology, and Mark talks about it on the video. I'm not going to quote the numbers, but we're sort of 75 or 80% of the way to the maximum scientific efficiency of solar panels to be able to convert light to energy, and wind to be able to convert wind to energy. So we've almost maxed out. It takes a huge amount of fossil fuels to mine it, and even if you had the batteries, the number of years it would take to create enough batteries to store enough power for 1 day of electricity use in the United States is impossible. And I love the word that you used, trade-offs, because, and again, this is not a knock on North Face. I think that they absolutely have the ability to sell to whoever they want to. But without fossil fuels, the world is energy deficient, which means costs go up, and all the people that were marching for social justice in the summer and that have no savings because of COVID and are now losing their jobs now have to pay more for their ability to live. And that to me seems crazy.
I agree with it more. I think that's the thing that, again, is poorly understood here, is the idea that low-cost energy is good for everybody, but in particular those that are on the lower side of the income distribution.
So
benefit them from.
And I always get in trouble for saying this, but I've always wanted to have a national day of we're not going to give you any fossil fuels today. Now, obviously, like the practical things is there's hundreds of millions of barrels in storage. There's hundreds of BCF in storage. So a day wouldn't matter. But I don't think that people see the true depth that hydrocarbons impacts them every day in their chemicals, in their plastics, in their cars. I don't think people who own Teslas realize that the power grid in the United States, 30% of the United States power is created by coal. So therefore, chances are when you plug your car in, that electricity is being made by a coal-fired plant somewhere. And we would both agree, I think, that coal has a much higher carbon footprint than other forms of fossil fuels. And I would exclude biomass, which have you seen the movie Planet of the Humans?
I have not.
It is a fascinating one. It was made by Michael Moore. Of all the people who would make a movie that would make environmentalists mad and actually sell the story, and one of the big ahas in that one was biomass. So there's biomass plants that take trees and they burn them, which obviously creates a lot of carbon and takes trees out of the world, which absorbs the carbon. And the way that they call it renewable and carbon neutral is, get this, they plant new trees to replace the old trees, and therefore it's carbon neutral. But if you're a natural gas company or a coal company whose product was made by the burial of these things over hundreds of millions of years, you can't plant trees to replace and be renewable. But 74% of the electrical generation in Asia is made from coal. And Canada's focusing on zero net emissions. The Paris Accord is zero net emissions. The US is actually down in carbon CO2 emissions over the last number of years because of natural gas and efficiency. And all of the carbon use that's coal is in Asia. And yet we're not trying to fix the problem in Asia, which makes me think that climate change is just it's a reason to make money for corporations, as opposed to like we really care about climate change. I'm curious if you would share that opinion.
Well, so I don't know what drives it. I think it's slightly different what's driving it. I'm sure there's some element of that, but I think a lot of it is a philosophical view that people have, that changing the planet is bad, almost a religious fervor around the idea that the planet was perfect before we showed up, and if humans impact that planet in any way, it's therefore inherently bad. Because I think you look at, there's many people out there, particularly young people, who I don't think have that religious style view of climate change for a financial reason. I think it's purely because they think that if we're changing the earth, it is therefore bad. Kind of start and stop. I think that's what drives a big chunk of it, but I don't fully understand.
It is interesting, and it begs a whole bunch of questions, like in terms of, and I've gotten in a couple debates on Twitter around the CO2. One of the things I had never thought about was, I mean, we know over the last multiple hundreds of millions of years, CO2 was substantially higher, and the reason that, and then changes occur. And so I think that people get hung up on the point of like, by having this conversation, we're climate change deniers. And I would 100% say I'm not. What I am not clear about in my position is, do I care that the planet is warming? Which I know sounds like, oh my God, or what about our children? But like, I think about the current planet has 7.8 billion people. And by 2050, it's expected to be at 9 billion people. Like, that's a lot of people for the planet to have. And I think I've kind of come out of COVID as like a degrowther, which is like, that's basically the whole, you can't change the planet and make it better. If we all just did less and consumed less and went back to the way it used to be miserable with short life expectancies and like villages trying to like sword fight with other villages. I'm curious about how my true feeling is on climate change. I'm curious yours.
So, that's there's a lot there. I think as I said before, I think the single most important thing, or the thing that I advocate for, is that energy is good. Energy helps human flourishing. There has been some change in our environment over the last 150 years, but I think again, in every single dimension that matters, humans have been able to flourish, irrespective of that small change in climate. And I have a ton of confidence that if the environment, again, continues to change modestly going forward, which it almost inherently will, even if we stop producing CO2, things would change. I have utmost confidence in humanity's ability, again, through technology, energy, all the basic building blocks of our current lifestyle, that we'd be able to come up with, that we would be able to be robust against those changes that are going to occur. And that if, so there'd be a million different solutions that humanity can create to modest changes to our climate around us. So that I'm very confident in. And further to your earlier point, I think I'm also very confident that if we dramatically reduce the use of hydrocarbons today, we would all live shorter, worse, more miserable lives, which I think we'd all agree is also bad. So that's where I come down on it, is that I think the trade-offs there are pretty straightforward. Which one is better than the other? Over time, there may be a better solution than hydrocarbons, almost certainly will be. I don't know what that will be. And when it comes, hey, I'm more power to them. I just don't know what that will be.
There's an interesting movie, I think it's a Woody Allen movie, called Midnight in Paris. And the premise is Owen Wilson, which is hard to believe that Owen Wilson would be in a Woody Allen movie, but he was actually pretty good. And he goes into a bar, and somehow the bar is like set back 50 years. And Owen Wilson like laments how bad things are now, and if only he could go back to the time of the 50s, it would be great. And then the people in the 50s want to go back to like the turn of the century, and the people at the turn of, which is odd, because I would think that life was a lot worse. Like, it actually was a lot worse. We didn't have the ability to make a vaccine in 9 months. We didn't have commercial air travel available to everyone to go anywhere they want for $71 and see their family. We didn't have technology where you could stream like we are today. The amount of energy that's required for the data for us just doing this, and for kids to have everything at their fingertips. Like, it feels like the world is better, and it's made better for all of our energy choices. It's my view.
Yeah, no, I think I couldn't agree more with that.
So let's pivot back a little bit to oil and gas and what you've seen. Now, you're private equity backed, if I recall from our conversations.
Correct.
And a bit of a consolidator is sort of a plan as you try and expand the share of wallet in terms of offering more services. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I think at our core knitting, I think what we're really good at is seeing what it is that our customers need at the coalface, what it is, how completions are evolving, how drilling practices are evolving, and using that information to feed back into our R&D process to develop the next incremental innovation in the drilling, completion, production phase of our customers' wells. So I think that's in our core DNA, what we try to be better at than anybody. In terms of growth, we try to do that organically, both through that R&D process as well as through acquisition in ways where if we find acquisition candidates which help us grow either into a new product line or into a new geography, we're always looking for interesting, accretive acquisitions that can help us grow. So over the years, Innovex, we've probably done something like 15 different acquisitions that have gone into the platform, which is now Innovex. But at the same time, a lot of the success we've had over the last 3 or 4 years have been driven by our organic R&Ds, our organic R&D pipeline. But very recently, we announced a big deal for us, the biggest deal, our biggest acquisition in the history of Innovex, which is the acquisition of Rubicon Oilfield International. Rubicon is similar in many ways to Innovex. They're a private equity-backed downhole tool business that was similarly focused on designing and building a pretty broad array of products used in the drilling, completion, and production phases of wells. I think the biggest distinction between the two enterprises is Innovex is predominantly U.S. land focused. Our business last year was 90% U.S. land. Rubicon is the opposite. They're much more international. So on a combined basis going forward, we'll be roughly 30 to 40% international. So we will have meaningful areas of operation in Mexico, Norway, Russia, UK, the Middle East. And so that gives us both, let's say, more stable operating environments where there's low cost oil plays out there where operators are going to continue to develop those reserves somewhat irrespectively, or at least less sensitive to oil and gas prices as folks are in the U.S. And then further, it gives us more areas to really create new innovations, bring new products to market out with the kind of core U.S. shale business.
How has the bid-ask spread been in the service industry? Because, and again, I know that you're in a slightly different segment, but I was on a panel maybe 3 months ago, and I said that if I were a drilling rig operator or a frac stimulator provider, I would be buying as much equipment I could from the competitors, and I would be blowtorching it because we don't need more. And so because of the change in surplus of there's so much equipment and so much less activity that presumably there's a big excess supply. How has that worked for bid-ask spread? And are you seeing that now that things are picking up a little bit more, we're seeing reasonable prices, or people just getting optimistic? How has that been in the business flow?
So I think for us, fortunately, what we do, most of what we do is manufactured consumable products. So we don't have some of the same capacity overhang that you see in some of the other verticals within oilfield service, thankfully. Certainly, we've seen the pricing challenges, which have bottomed and seem to have starting to get a little bit better. But we don't have the exact same dynamic as the coil guys or the frac guys. We have been so consumed this year on the Rubicon deal that we haven't spent a lot of time looking at other deals. So it's hard to say, hey, how is the bid-ask spread going? Is that coming together? I mean, typically the problem we have in our business is we like to evaluate things on some kind of trailing EBITDA basis. And, when you have 6 months where EBITDA is zero or negative for a lot of folks, it is very challenging to get confidence around that bid-ask spread. So I think you see a lot of deals, this one included, which are all stock transactions where you can compare each other on some kind of relative 2019 performance or current performance, but you're not exchanging cash at the valuation that's contemplated.
Well, I want to tie it back a little bit to climate change, because as you said, you talked about growing the international. You talked about what's going on with the U.S. onshore business. And then we just talked about the world's overwhelming need for energy. And I am very proud, having been, I spent 20 years of my career, both in Canada and the United States, producing, developing oil and gas. And I would put out there that our regulations, our even though we flare, are relatively, the amount we flare relative to other parts of the world, so much less. The safety we have for our employees, the equipment that we provide, the money and time that we invest in our industry and our communities to make it better. And I put it out there that I think you're right, that acquiring an international service company is the way, because if I'm Saudi and I'm sitting here and people are telling me that we want to get off your primary export, which is oil, or your Iran, or your Libya, or your Iraq, or your UAE, or your Russia, you're saying, well, okay, I have 50 years to get all my product out. I would think that they are going to materially increase their production over the coming 10 years, which will negatively impact the US business. And as it ties back to regulations, we have amongst the best regulations here. And so if the Green New Deal is trying to, and things like it, is trying to negatively impact international development so that we can develop our own solution here, I would say it's going to have the exact opposite, because we'll have cheap energy that we're just going to import from elsewhere and have no control over the carbon footprint like we do here. Do you agree with international, and as that all ties together?
So what I find appealing is I see where you're coming from. It's hard for me to predict the future at all. Certainly what some of those areas that you talked about, how they might behave going forward, but I can certainly see a rationale for the Saudis, the Russians, the other folks within OPEC behaving that way, where they do increase production, thinking that there's a finite time for them to do that. I don't know that they will, but I certainly think that's a risk. If nothing else, some of those places, Saudi in particular, is very low lifting cost. It's super strategic to that country. So whether they stay flat, grow it a little bit, grow it a lot, I don't know. But I do know that those areas will continue to invest heavily. Now, there's trade-offs, there's challenges there as well. So I like being diverse. I like the U.S. market is so much easier to operate in. You have to be nimble. You learn a lot. We have the best people. It's a tremendous place to play, and we can create value here. But I think having that diversity, the exposure to other international markets, so that we are, again, kind of robust against how things might play out in the oil business over the next 5-10 years, is nothing but good can come from that.
Well, I'll build on, before I ask you one final question, I'll build on what you just said, which is the U.S. and Canada, but the U.S. is a great place to operate. And so my cynicism around climate change is everyone's focused on the U.S., which means they're creating a new market with carbon taxes, carbon credits. Tesla gets talked about all the time, but their profitability comes from not selling cars, but from selling carbon credits to other car companies for the CO2 they're not creating. So we create this regulatory framework which creates a capitalist opportunity for government officials to enrich themselves and for new companies to enrich themselves in, as you said, a very easy climate to operate in. Certainly much more safe than going to Venezuela and having your assets confiscated like Conoco, or going to Russia and discovering that they don't actually want American companies over there. So my cynical answer around climate change is the people pushing it and the people financing it don't actually care about the climate apocalypse. They care about building in a narrative that allows carbon credits to be sold, and they happen to be standing between that market and the end market, and they will take their fees and make trillions of dollars, and that is where the next billionaires and trillionaires will come from. So you don't have to comment on that. That's very controversial, but that is my cynicism around the whole climate change. It's a capitalist construct. Now, if you could go back and give yourself advice that would accelerate your career and make a meaningful change in getting you to where you are today faster, what advice would you give yourself to a younger Adam, say 20 years ago?
So I think, God, that's always a difficult question. I think one thing that comes to mind is just be willing to, I think when you're coming up and you're young and you're trying to prove that you're very capable, I think at times people can be not willing enough to ask as many questions as they should, assuming that folks expect them to know all the answers to things. So I think one is just be willing to ask a ton of questions of everybody around you who knows the industry and the space very well. So be a sponge for information. I think the second one is be willing to take the jobs that other people don't want to do, and be willing to go to the places that are important, and be willing to bite that off when other folks want to maybe stay in more comfortable roles and more comfortable areas. So I think those two things come to mind first and foremost when you ask that question.
Good. Well, it was great to catch up via Zoom. I know it's been a while since we've had coffee together, and I'm sorry it's sort of under these circumstances, but I like it because it frames up a conversation that I think is important, which is trade-offs in energy, but also like the role of a company. And I think we came that North Face has the right to do it, and you're absolutely not complaining about the right to do it. It's just maybe their approach is intellectually dishonest. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I think the most ironic thing of the whole their whole position, which we haven't talked about yet, is the fact that the very product which we were looking to buy is made from hydrocarbons. So I think I would just ask them to reconsider their stance in view of not only what the good that energy does for the world, but also the fact that the products which they make are solely dependent on the hydrocarbons which the hardworking men and women of our industry produce.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Adam, thank you so much. Happy holidays to you and your family. Be safe, and I appreciate you coming on the show and talking about it. We will have a link to the letter that you wrote and a couple other things that we talked about with pollution, energy poverty, and that Mark Mills from PragerU that can give some good talking points on the unobtainium that is green energy.
Well, thank you very much, David. Appreciate you having us on.
Wonderful. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day.